All right, let's dive in. We're about to jump into a 250-year period of just absolute chaos and incredible rebirth that completely changed the face of a continent. This is the story of how the medieval world, a world built on promises and prayer, was shattered and then reborn into something that looks a lot more like our own.
So, to really get this, you first have to totally erase the map of Europe that you have in your head. Seriously. After the Roman Empire crumbled, Europe wasn't a collection of countries. It was this fractured, chaotic patchwork of tiny, warring kingdoms. Your survival didn't depend on a flag or a nation, but on personal promises and who could protect you locally.
And that brings us to the big question, right? How did this incredibly decentralized world, a world based on personal loyalty, completely reinvent itself in just 2.5 centuries? Well, the answer involves a ton of war, a devastating plague, and a radical new way of seeing the world and our place. So, what did this fractured continent actually look like? What was life like after that great unifying force of Rome was nothing more than a memory? Honestly, the picture was pretty bleak. With no central government, those old Roman trade routes just withered away. Learning and intellectual life, that became a luxury for only a handful of monks and nobles. The idea of a unified Europe was completely gone. The single most important thing day to day was security, and people looked to local warlords, not some faraway king, to give it to them. And that desperate need for security, it gave birth to a really unique social structure that would define the entire age. It was a world built on promises, a system we now call feudalism. The whole system, and this is the key, ran on a really simple exchange. See, in a world where cash was pretty scarce, land was the ultimate currency. A king would grant a huge chunk of land, they called it a fief, to a powerful lord. And in return, he didn't want money. He wanted a promise, your loyalty, and your knights when it was time for war. So this web of promises creates this very rigid social pyramid. It starts at the top with the king, who's granting land to his most powerful lords. Those lords, who are now his vassals, they turn around and carve up their land for knights who promise to fight for them. And then, way down at the bottom, you have the serfs. They're the ones farming the land for everyone else, all in exchange for the one thing they want most: protection. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Serf sounds a lot like slave, right? But there's a really, really important difference. A serf wasn't considered property. You couldn't buy or sell a person. Instead, they were bound to the land. Their life was incredibly hard, no question, but they were a part of the manor, not just a possession of the lord. Okay, so if feudalism was the political skeleton of the Middle Ages, what was the cultural glue holding it all together? In this super fragmented Europe, there was one institution with overwhelming power and influence: the Roman Catholic Church. And I mean, the church's influence was absolute. It wasn't just about going to Mass on Sunday, not even close. It was the center of education. It ran the very first universities. It was the biggest patron of the arts, telling stories from the Bible in stone and stained glass to a population that mostly couldn't read. And its political power? It was huge. Popes could, and did, bring kings to their knees. But of course, that kind of power doesn't go unchallenged. One of the biggest flashpoints was something called the lay investiture controversy. And really, it all boiled down to one question: who gets to appoint the bishops? Kings argued, hey, they're in my kingdom, I should get to pick them. The Pope, of course, fired back that only the church could appoint its own officials. This was this titanic struggle for power that pretty much defined the era. So you've got this world that seems pretty stable, right? Built on these two huge pillars, feudalism and the church. But a series of massive shocks were about to hit, and they were going to shatter that stability and forge something totally new. First up, the Crusades. The reasons for these huge military campaigns were, well, they were complicated. It was a mix of faith, greed, and raw ambition. You had younger sons who wouldn't inherit the family land, looking to carve out kingdoms of their own. Merchants saw a chance for lucrative new trade routes. And the church saw a way to point all that violent energy of its knights outward, promising heaven as a reward for fighting. Next, you've got a war that dragged on for more than 100 years. It was devastating for sure, but it had this profound psychological effect. For pretty much the first time, soldiers and peasants started to think of themselves not just as loyal to their local lord, but as English or as French. This was the very painful birth of national identity. And then came a catastrophe, on a scale that's almost impossible for us to imagine: the Black Death. In the 14th century, this plague just tore across Europe, killing nearly one-third of the entire population. 1 out of every 3 people. Gone. But here's the crazy, horrifying paradox of it all. This unparalleled disaster completely flipped the social order on its head. With so many people dead, workers were suddenly scarce. For the first time in centuries, the surviving peasants actually had leverage. They could demand wages, better conditions, even their freedom. And that dealt a fatal blow to the old feudal system. So, out of the ashes of war and plague and a crumbling feudal order, a new spirit began to emerge. Europe was on the verge of a cultural rebirth. We call this period the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth. It was this incredible time when scholars and artists started looking back, past what they saw as the dark Middle Ages, all the way back to the classical world of Greece and Rome for inspiration. And it sparked this explosion of creativity and curiosity. So, what fueled this amazing rebirth? Well, for one thing, new money. Those trade routes that opened up during the Crusades created a rising middle class of merchants and bankers who had cash to spend. You had powerful families, like the Medicis in Florence, who became huge patrons of the arts. And then came a technological game changer, Gutenberg's printing press, which meant ideas could suddenly spread like wildfire. And this all points to the core philosophical shift of the whole era, a new way of thinking called humanism. Now, it didn't reject God, but it put humanity back at the center of the story. It celebrated human potential, our reason, and individual achievement in a way that had been basically unthinkable for 1,000 years. Okay, so let's just step back for a second and look at the sheer scale of the transformation we've just covered. It's huge. I mean, just think about this. Around the year 1200, power is all local, held by feudal lords. By 1450, you have kings centralizing power and building the first modern nations. Society goes from this rigid pyramid with serfs at the bottom to a much more dynamic world with a rising middle class. And ideas go from being totally dominated by the church to making room for human reason and individual potential. The entire world changed. Which really leaves us with a final question, doesn't it? Should we see this as the end of a so-called dark age? Or was it actually the messy, violent, and ultimately brilliant birth of the modern world? It's a period of chaos and rebirth that proves that sometimes entire worlds have to fall for new ones to be built. Thanks for joining me.